Can you all hear me? Merdad, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, good.
Okay, so I think Noura said she'll be here in a minute. So I think we should just get going. So hi everyone, my name is Merdad Daryush. I'm an MA student at the Kevorkian Center for Near Eastern Studies at NYU. I'm excited to be moderating an amazing panel as part of the Columbia Tuition Strike Coalition teach-in, which we've titled Justice for Palestine, Justice for All. Thank you all for being here. So in October of 2020, the student group Columbia University Apartheid Divest, which was launched by Columbia Students for Justice in Palestine, or SJP, as well as Barnard Columbia Jewish Voice for Peace, organized a student referendum at Columbia College on whether or not the university should divest from companies that profit from or engage in the State of Israel's actions toward Palestinians. The referendum demands align with those of the global boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, also known as BDS. So 61% of Columbia College undergraduates voted to divest. Yet, in a statement after the results, Columbia President Lee Bollinger refused to take the student vote under consideration. And as we know by now, the Columbia student strike is about more than a mere tuition reduction. This is about making the university transparent. This is about making the university democratic. That's why the strike coalition, which is proud to include Columbia SJP, lists as one of its 5 key demands the university's divestment from human rights violations against Palestinians in support of BDS. So we're honored to have 5 remarkable scholars and activists speak to us today on the question of Palestine and its centrality to the universal struggle to organize for equality, justice, and peace. We have Sumaya Awad, who's a New York-based Palestinian socialist activist. Sumaya is the co-founder of the Against Canary Mission Project and the co-editor of the recent book, Palestine, A Socialist Introduction. And we have Omar Barghouti. Omar is a Palestinian human rights defender, writer, the co-founder of BDS, and a Columbia alum. We have Noura Erakat, who is a Palestinian-American human rights lawyer and assistant professor of Africana Studies at Rutgers University. Noura is the co-founding editor of Jadaliya magazine and the author of Justice for Some, Law and the Question of Palestine. We have Rashid Khalidi, the Edward Said Professor of Modern Arab Studies at Columbia University. Rashid is the editor of the Journal for Palestine Studies, and most recently, the author of The 100 Years' War on Palestine, A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance. And finally, we have Barnaby Raine, an activist and intellectual historian writing his PhD at Columbia University on the history of socialist thought. Barnaby has written extensively on the question of anti-Semitism in the UK and the US. So before we begin, I invite our audience, however you're watching, to submit questions to our panel, which we'll try to get to at the end of our, unfortunately, far too short of discussion. But now to introduce us to the BDS movement for Palestinian rights, I hand it off to Omar.
Thank you very much, Merdad, and everyone for hosting me. I'm honored to stand with your inspiring tuition strike, which is setting a crucial example in democratizing higher education and challenging the corporate power structure that prevails. I salute your intersectional endorsement of what Angela Davis calls the indivisibility of justice. Trump is gone, but going back to the neoliberal, military-industrial, hegemonic business as usual should not be an option. The hibernation of progressives while waiting for justice to rain on us from Washington, D.C. is not an option. Inhibited dreams and tamed activism are not an option. The South African Black consciousness leader Steve Biko wrote, quote, "The most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed," end of quote. Indeed, through sustained violence and racist dehumanization, or stubbornly denying our rights, our oppressors try to colonize our minds with hopelessness and to sear into our consciousness rigid limits to our visions of freedom and justice. We fight back with hope that emanates from our strategic and unassailably ethical praxis. In this spirit, allow me to share some of our experiences in the BDS movement pertaining to reconciling ethical principles with strategic, goal-oriented effectiveness in our struggle for Palestinian freedom, justice, and equality. I hope this modestly contributes to your indispensable campaign at Columbia. Inspired by the South African anti-apartheid movement and the US civil rights movement, BDS was launched in 2005 by the broadest coalition in Palestinian society. It calls for ending the 1967 occupation, ending the institutionalized and legalized system of racial discrimination and domination, which meets the UN definition of apartheid, and upholding the right of return for Palestinian refugees to the lands from which they were uprooted in the 1947-1948 Nakba, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. Anchored in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the BDS movement has consistently and categorically opposed all forms of racism and discrimination, including anti-Black, anti-Indigenous racism, sexism, homo and transphobia, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism. Identity should never diminish or restrict one's entitlement to rights. Our movement, therefore, targets complicity, not identity. Human rights defenders often face the dilemma of whether we should, in our campaigning, prioritize ethical principles over goal-oriented efficacy. But these are not necessarily mutually exclusive. In fact, opting for one extreme or the other can be detrimental to any justice movement. If we set our objectives too high in order to meet our utmost ethical and political standards, we would undoubtedly condemn our struggle to ineffectiveness and perhaps become addicted to marginalization. We would lose sight then of the real objectives we had set out to achieve. We would become delusional, celebrating every noise we make in our comfortable revolutionary bubble as if it were the roar of a nearing and resounding victory. On the other hand, if our objectives conveniently responded only to the pragmatic requirements of current circumstances and balances of power, without much regard to our principles and long-term goals, we would run the risk of being co-opted by hegemonic oppressors, while basking in the limelight of their recognition that we've become moderate and responsible enough to be granted a low seat at their high table. We would, in that scenario, disconnect at once from our roots of struggle and our vision for a just, dignified future. Rather than breaking the chains of our oppression, we would be settling, in effect, for simply making those chains more comfortable, as Archbishop Desmond Tutu once warned. Being revolutionary, then, is not about raising the most radical slogans that are not implementable and that therefore have little chance of contributing to concrete processes aimed at ending oppression. That would be unethical, not just unstrategic. What is truly revolutionary and ethical is raising a slogan that is principled and realistically ambitious, yet conducive to action on the ground that can lead to real change towards justice and emancipation. I truly believe that your tuition strike, just as the 2018 Barnard referendum and the 2020 Columbia College referendum on divesting from Israeli crimes against Palestinians, meets this definition of being ethical and truly revolutionary. To reconcile principle with effectiveness, the BDS target selection criteria are, quickly, the level of complicity, targeting the most complicit companies, intersectionality, targeting companies that oppress more than one community, mass appeal, targeting the more well-known brands to reach the mass media and the mass public, potential for success, which means we only campaign against a target when there's a reasonable chance of achieving our most important objectives. And the three corresponding operational principles that guide our campaigns are gradualness, sustainability, and context sensitivity. Regardless, we must always ask ourselves whether we are really being both principled and strategically effective. In our context, Israel's siege, ethnic cleansing, killings, home demolitions, theft of land, and so on are all intensifying. Some of the companies that your tuition money is invested in are still complicit in these Israeli crimes against us. So how do we assess the effectiveness of BDS? Assessing impact is, in my view, a sophisticated art and an inexact science. It is context sensitive and always evolving. We know we need to periodically evaluate our strategies, partially to assess to what degree we've achieved our objectives. Quantitative assessment of impact is crucial, but so is qualitative assessment, such as gauging our influence on the narrative in the media, in academia, in the cultural sphere, on raising awareness beyond our comfort zone, on impacting policy, and that's key, and so on. Planting seeds and caring for them with patience is key in social justice struggles. When the BDS movement pioneered mass education about apartheid, being part of Israel's entire regime against the Palestinian people, this analysis, for instance, was shunned by the mainstream. Now, we're finally mainstreaming the apartheid analysis with a lot of help, one must admit, from Israel's unmasked far right. One point of caution, though. Our enemies' vicious attacks on us often indicate our impact. But how do we know they're not playing us with strategic decoying, diverting our resources and attention away from possibly more effective paths of resistance and solidarity? We need to assess then whether they're accompanying their severe rhetorical attacks with a commensurate investment of resources in fighting us. We also need to examine whether our impact is independently verified through data and research to confirm the movement's effectiveness. To end, throughout our struggles for justice, we must adhere to inclusiveness and intellectual humility. And we must always insist on defining ourselves and our aspirations. Toni Morrison once said, quote, "Definitions belong to the definers, not the defined," end of quote. Let's never let them define us, confine our dreams, or defile our struggle. Let's be the definers of our peace, our justice, and our destiny. Thank you.
Thank you, Omar, for these wonderful remarks and this framing of what we're organizing for. We're here to redefine what this struggle is, and I'm so excited as we proceed in this discussion to be able to, do the part of, decentering those false narratives. So I want to turn to Rashid and say, if we want to be successful in our organizing today, there are historical misconceptions about Israel and Palestine that we have to displace. So I want to ask you, how is Palestinian history instructive to the current stage of this struggle? I'm thinking specifically of your argument in your recent book, The 100 Years' War on Palestine, which describes the Palestinian struggle as one against the twin processes of settler colonialism and this exclusivist nationalism that we know as Zionism. So could you outline this history for all of us?
Thanks so much for inviting me to address this group. And I join Omar in saluting the students who have taken an enormously important initiative in standing up, not just against the callousness of an $11.5 billion endowed university in charging students the highest tuition of any American university for what we know to be an educational experience that is really lacking given the circumstances, but also for stressing the undemocratic nature of the way in which this university operates and the callous ignoring by the university of a very clearly expressed view of an overwhelming majority of students in favor of the university divesting from companies that harm people, not just in Palestine, in many places, as Omar pointed out. And I think that I'm touched that in the midst of all of the travails that students are undergoing, they should have seen fit as a central part of their demands to insist that the university pay attention to student views, and for that matter, faculty views on issues like divestment and also on issues like climate change and other things that your strike has touched upon. I think it shows a high level of responsibility and a high level of militance on the part of the students and a political consciousness, frankly. In 8 minutes, I can't summarize how important I think the history of Palestine, as you said, to make it brief, and I will try and make it brief. But I think that Palestine serves as a sort of a touchstone for so many of the issues that concern us as citizens in the United States and of the world. What happened this summer in the United States, the uprising over Black Lives Matter in the wake of the murder on video of George Floyd, raises issues having to do with racism, systematic racism, racial discrimination generally. A core part of the problem of Palestine is racism. It's been obscured that this is what's at stake, but as Omar pointed out, structures of racial discrimination are the basic bedrock of the system that has been imposed in Palestine over more than 70 years. I think it's absolutely essential to talk about this. I think it's essential to talk about this in Minneapolis and New York, but also in Ramallah and Tel Aviv, and also in London and Paris. You are students at Columbia. We are faculty at Columbia. We're concerned with the United States, but we're also concerned with the world. The corporations that the university invests in are doing harm. They are serving to provide the weapons, the bulldozers, for the oppression of an entire people in Palestine and in many other places around the globe. So the first thing is racism. The second thing is colonialism. We live in the midst of one of the great colonial projects of modern history, the United States of America, where the indigenous population was systematically destroyed in order to implant this project. There is a kindred spirit to this in many other parts of the globe, in Canada, in Australia, formerly in South Africa, in New Zealand, but also in Israel. And I think that bringing this up is important in terms of struggles in the United States over the Keystone Pipeline, over indigenous rights, as well as in Australia and Canada and other places where settler colonialism has established a viable national project, but where the sequels of it, the harm done by it, is still not been fully addressed. It hasn't even begun to be addressed in Palestine. And to address it, we have to diagnose the problem. The problem is not just one people and another people, or two national movements, or right against right. These are essentially nonsensical obfuscations to prevent us from seeing that Israel is the result of a settler colonial project, which has erected a structure of racial discrimination, where one group has rights that another group is not allowed to have. Very simple. Jim Crow, apartheid, the Israeli system created by Zionism. Finally, this ties us in to issues that should concern all of us as Americans. We just had a transition from one administration to another, but something that has not changed and will not change is the appetite for eternal war abroad. Part of that eternal war abroad is being waged in Palestine with almost $4 billion annually of American military support for an occupation. That's what that money is going for. And that is why we don't have a proper train station in New York City. That's why we have the worst airports in the world in New York City. That's why we have the kind of so-called budget problems that we have, because tens and tens and tens and hundreds of billions of dollars are spent on supporting a war machine that's engaged in wars all over the planet. And by proxy is engaged in suppressing the Palestinian people. So if we want to have forgiveness of student loans, if we want to have an annual minimum wage that gives people the right to dignity, we need to have a complete change in the priorities of this country. And one of those changes has to be an end to eternal wars abroad, one of which is the war that Israel wages every single day on the Palestinian people, with $4 billion almost annually of military aid, and with many, many billions of dollars in tax-free 501c3 donations to things like the Friends of the Israel Defense Forces and colonial settlements being built on Palestinian land, stolen from Palestinians day by day, every single day of the year. So I think that Amma very aptly put it, we're trying to balance between what you can do and what is ethical. What would be ethical is to oppose everything. You can't oppose everything. You have to pick your strategic targets. And I think that the strike has done that extremely effectively, stressing not just the way in which they're screwing students and their parents by demanding outrageous amounts of tuition in a situation where other universities have done much more to relieve the strain on students, and where other university presidents have taken a cut in their enormous salaries, which our president unfortunately hasn't seen fit to do. So I think that bringing all of these things up is absolutely appropriate, as has been something that I'm very grateful for, a recognition of the fact that overwhelming majorities of Columbia and Barnard students have voted in favor of something that the university has simply disregarded in the most arrogant possible way, showing how things are run around here and showing why a strike like this is necessary. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rashid. We really appreciated your support. So I wanted to ask Noura now, but this is also a question for you, Rashid, if you're able. But Noura, in your recent book titled Justice for Some, you explain how we got to the present political situation in Palestine through the deployment of law as both a tool of oppression, but also resistance. I just wanted to ask you, when we speak about settler colonialism, when we speak about apartheid in Palestine, what do these things look like? What is the present political situation? You use terms like ghettoized local autonomy, Israeli legally legitimized total sovereignty for Israel. What do these mean, and how did we get here?
Thanks so much. I want to echo also my absolute awe at the student organizing and total support for the rejection of what is essentially the neoliberalization of higher education at a moment when movement that ushered the removal of a neo-fascist in the form of Trump and his base, which remains, because this is a structure around us, is owed something and has been demanding the cancellation of student debt. And yet the response of Columbia University is not only to disregard that, but to add insult to injury by diverting their losses onto the students themselves as if they were consumers of a product, which also feeds into the lack of academic integrity and the diminishing of academic independence, right? Which has been used in order to smear Palestinian academics and Palestine studies altogether. I mean, so all of this fits into to this framework of, you know, the relationship between the neoliberalization in the university, hyper militarization, and US imperialism, which has one of its focal points in Palestine. As Rashid has emphasized, we have to remember that Palestine is both exemplary of a universal condition of settler colonization, resistance to native erasure, resistance to imperial expansion, and hegemony, as well as the specificities which the Palestinian experience has, that is in fact unlike any other because of the temporal moment in which it happens and the way that anti-Semitism has been weaponized and perverted into a project that has not only failed to protect Jewish peoples in a broader struggle against white supremacy, from which the mass scale of atrocity against Jews develops, but also in a way that eclipses how Zionism is basically obfuscates the way that the United States can speak out of one side of its mouth that it both opposes anti-Semitism and in order to cover for itself to expand its imperial project in the Middle East. And so I think that it's great that students have emphasized the need to place Palestine as part of this broader teach-in, which is a teach-in about capitalism, which is a teach-in about racial capitalism and a teach-in about imperialism, and to emphasize that, you know, militarism abroad isn't just about the profit-making mechanisms of US weapons manufacturers, the DoD, and the industries of transport, right? It's not just the weapons themselves, but the pieces of the weapons, how the weapons are transported, which is depriving a model of universal health care, depriving a model of the cancellation of student debt, but also a way of reifying American exceptionalism at home. If the United States is in fact purported to be a flawed democracy and not in fact a white settler colony, then it can place itself as a global police in the world that obfuscates ongoing settler colonization, that obfuscates the subjugation of American Blacks in the United States, not as a form of a lack of inequality, but as a form of a colonial system that it continues to oversee, from which they can extract and exploit those bodies, and as a way to continue asserting geopolitical control, even when there is no extraction of resources, in order to prevent other powers from access to those resources. So then what about Palestine then, about the history of the present? What I want to say is, you ask, how is it that we get here? And so when I emphasize the idea of what is this history of the present, the worst thing that the United States has done in attempting to appear as somehow, right, a moral, offering a moral good in the world, is to frame this as an issue, a conflict between two peoples, an intractable conflict. They just have to figure out how to get along, right? So it's the same thing that we do in the United States, that rather than tackling racial capitalism, we want to give CEOs and police officers diversity training, instead of actually getting into the weeds of what does power have to do with it. And in this case, the power that has to do with it is the fact that, as Rashid has pointed out, Zionism is not a Jewish national liberation project. Zionism emerges from an imperialist context in order to further what is considered a civilizing mission and an economic enterprise. And so how that evolves, how Jews define themselves as a nation, is not here what's at issue, but what Zionism, political Zionism, it in fact is a settler colonization movement that is facilitated through imperial sponsorship, first by the British and then by the United States, which is the current phase that we're in, that is predicated on the implantation of settler sovereignty that requires the removal and rejection of a nascent native sovereignty that preceded it. And so this, we don't want to complicate it with big terms. It's basically the idea to remove and replace, which is precisely what Palestinians continue to battle against. And all of that diminishes, is gone, when then the United States refracts it. Even the liberal parts of the US political establishment, which are not by any means, even if they are better than the right, they are by no means radical or revolutionary, want to frame this as conflict and necessitating conflict resolution, and not turning, wanting to blame Trump, for example, for the transfer of the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, wanting to blame Trump for the ending $364 million of humanitarian aid to Palestinian refugees, wanting to blame Trump for, they don't even talk about Gaza. They're not blaming Trump for Gaza. Nobody does, because of the extreme forms of dehumanization that happens to Palestinians as a result of the targeting of the Gaza Strip, and the ways that we don't even attempt to understand what Hamas is. But the idea of making Trump into the bad guy in a way to absolve the United States for what it has done and wants to continue to do has been made clear by the Democratic National Committee, that has said, right, and instructed Biden, don't return the embassy. They want to keep the embassy, right? And on all the previous administrations, Democrat and Republican, made that possible, made that embassy move possible, made the colonization of all of Palestine possible, not just impending annexations possible, and have also said that they want to oppose boycott, divestment, and sanctions, notwithstanding all of their commitments to liberal ethos like First Amendment rights of free speech, right? And here we see the exceptionalization come up again around Palestine. So what I would advise for us to think about is, this is not something far away, but is something entwined with a US system that is still committed to expanding settler colonization, that is still committed to, maintaining white supremacy as a system, is still committed to the universalization of European sovereignty, of political governance and European societies, which it imposes on all peoples, which thereby creates a racialized hierarchy that we can't escape from unless we reject it and create those alternatives. And so that also means liberating the university as a space that's not only based on a consumerist model of, training students in order to be cogs in the wheel of, a neoliberal economy, but training critical thinkers who rise to the challenge of actually confronting it and creating alternatives. And we've seen that the most in movements that have articulated what abolition means in the form of creating mutual aid, communities of care, defunding the police, dismantling a war on terrorism apparatus, demilitarizing the US, some form of reparations, right, to holding administration officials to account. And here I want to lay full accountability on the feet of the Obama administration, which absolved the entire Bush administration for constructing a war on terror that continues unabated, and for inflicting torture, for maintaining the, this black hole of Guantanamo Bay. And that has held no one to account for torture. Right? It's this kind of amnesia that when I'm in the classroom talking to my students and I mention Guantanamo, and the students, sophomores and juniors, look at me like I'm nuts. Like, what language did I just speak? Right? That's not a mistake. And that's what I think, I'm very honored to be part of this. And I'm glad that we center Palestine, not as the exception here, but as part of this broader framework in challenging this university model, and also of challenging imperialism.
Thank you so much, Noura, and thank you to both of you for centering the role of US policy in the history of settler colonialism in Palestine, which, we have the power to change through support for BDS. I want to turn to Sumaya now. So your book, Palestine, A Socialist Introduction, brings in a number of brilliant scholars and activists, including yourself, to situate the Palestinian movement for liberation within a universal struggle guided by socialist principles. My question, how do we, as members of the left, see Palestine through this socialist lens? And how do we organize for it alongside other anti-capitalist struggles?
Thanks, Mehrdad, and thanks, Noura, Omar, and Rashid. It's a little intimidating to follow the three of you, I have to say, but I'm going to do my best. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the main things that the book puts forward is that Palestine is not going to be liberated in isolation. And I think that's what the previous three speakers have also alluded to. But I actually want to start by taking us to the Middle East for a second and just debunking, I think, a common assumption that it's only now that people are asserting socialism in Palestine in the same conversation. That in fact, there's like a very rich tradition of Marxism and of socialism in the Middle East that spans decades. And that's sort of what the book is based on and is trying to bring to light. That said, of course, there's a lot of lessons that we should learn and take from, there it is, that we need to take from and learn from these previous movements for liberation that often posited socialist and communist ideas, because clearly they didn't work and they had many, many faults, but that it exists. And so what we're doing now is just building on that. And I think one of the main things about that I really want to drive home is that our goal for Palestinian liberation is not simply to get rid of the occupation. It's much more than that. It's about envisioning what kind of free Palestine we want to build. Well, in the same way that here in the US, that's what we're doing when we're talking about a new world, when we're talking about defeating capitalism and US empire. And so when we think about what new type of vision we want to posit, we have to think about who is going to replace the existing structures in Palestine, right? That we don't want to just replace our oppressors, but we want to build something new. And this year marks 10 years since the start of the Arab Spring, right? When Arab masses across the region came out and demanded the fall of their regime, demanded a new vision, a new type of society. And although they didn't all posit socialist views explicitly, they were fighting for this new kind of world that isn't built for profit, right? Where profit is not the motive for everything that we all deserve, the basic rights that we have. And I think that's what we mean with the book and what my organizing does, which is to focus on what does it mean to build a different kind of world in Palestine and the Middle East? What does it mean to think about Palestine being liberated, not in isolation, but as part of the liberation of the masses across the region and of course, globally. And what that really means is material change rooted in economic and political systems that don't serve to elevate the upper rings of Palestinian ruling and middle classes, but actually serve the vulnerable in Palestine, the refugees, the workers. Those are the people that we want to build a free Palestine for. Those are the people that are building and fighting for a free Palestine. And we're going to come up against capitalism as we do so. And I think that's very clear. And we certainly learned that in the 90s, when what the Palestinian leadership was doing was engaging in all sorts of negotiations that failed completely and actually set us back. And that's not what we want to try to do again. That's not what our goal is. So that's the thrust of the argument that it is important for us to think about socialism as we organize to free Palestine and to integrate anti-capitalism into all of our decolonial movements. And then just to get at the second part of your question, I think it's very promising that this burgeoning left, the socialist movement in the US, is positing Palestine as an important issue in its political struggle. I think that people are really connecting the struggles they go through here in this country as workers, as Black people, as people of color, as immigrants, to the injustices elsewhere in the world that the US is propping up. And certainly Palestine is one of those. And they're making these connections, I think, more so than ever before in a very material way, not abstractly as, discussions, but actually in their everyday lived experiences, connecting to these injustices abroad, to what workers abroad are facing beyond our borders. And I think that's huge. And I think what that means is that we are winning the ideological battle. It's slow. We're not there yet. We have a lot of work to do. And I think a lot of the questions that Ahmad posited about strategy and tactics are crucial to us actually fully winning. But I think that this is a big step, that people in the US who want to challenge the status quo want to make Palestine a priority, because what's happening in Palestine is a massive human rights violation. And it's supported by the US government, right? It's being propped up by the US government in so many ways with political, commercial, military, diplomatic support. So it's intuitive that people here who want to stop home demolitions in Palestine, who want to put an end to the blockade, to the indiscriminate killing of Palestinians, as they advocate for these issues, there's an understanding that actually the decisions made in DC, the various policies that exist in the US, from curtailing freedom of speech, in New York is a good example of this, Cuomo's blacklist, right? That blacklists organizations, nonprofits, et cetera, that boycott Israel, or legislation that's pending in New York and across the country that threatens to penalize financially and otherwise individuals or companies or schools that engage with those who boycott Israel. And that's because these boycotts are a direct attack on capitalism, right? They threaten the very structure of how the state is able to reproduce itself. And for Israel, that means its ability to reproduce its apartheid state and its occupation. So I think that when people say, why are we singling out Israel? It's like there's this grave injustice that's been unfolding for over 7 decades, and that the US has a major role in sustaining it. So it's actually intuitive to single out Israel. Our government is singling out Israel. And we're sort of following that. I'll just end by saying that I think, as Omar mentioned, I think, and maybe we'll get to this later if we have time, but I think this attack that's happening right now against Palestine activists, the censorship of advocacy on college campuses, is because of how we're winning this ideological battle. And I think college campuses in particular play such an important role, because that's often where the state injects its ideas, right? A lot of institutions, certainly institutions like Columbia, they play a very important role in sustaining the priorities of US empire, right, and reproducing them. After all, it's the students at these elite universities that then go on to become workers and administrators. So interjecting ideas and sort of really cracking down on freedom of speech, on any idea that threatens to shake the priorities of US empire or question them, have to be shut down in order for the state to be able to reproduce the kind of workers that it wants. And that's why it's such a threat. But it's also why this campus organizing that you all are doing is so incredibly important, and has a reverberating effect, I think, for many years to come that we will see in the future. So really props to you on that, and I'll stop there.
Thank you, Sumaya. Actually, if it's okay, I'd like to stay with you for just a few more minutes. As you brought up the opposition that activists face, like the intimidation tactics. And so I would like to ask you about your work, the mission behind the Against Canary Mission project. So why did you feel the need to create Against Canary Mission? What does it try to accomplish?
Yes, and I'll try to be quick, but feel free to tell me to stop talking. I won't take it personally. So Canary Mission, for those who don't know, is an online blacklist that was founded in 2015 and that now has a little over 2,000, I believe, profiles of student activists and professors, but the majority are students. And the aim of the Canary Mission blacklist, and there are other blacklists, but I think Canary Mission is one of the largest, is to censor, silence, intimidate, threaten, chill students speaking out against what's happening in Israel and the complicity of the US government. And it's actually, it sounds, when you hear it, it's like, oh, wow, that's bad, that's horrible. But when you really start to study what it does, it's absolutely horrifying and it's incredibly dangerous. Because what it does is it makes students, it sidelines them, and it ultimately tries to push them out of the social and political circles of campus life, right? It's saying, if you do this, you will be shamed because we're going to say you're anti-Semitic, right? It's a form of shaming students for their activism. If you're a student that's not a citizen, your immigration status is at risk because you are labeled on the internet as a quote unquote terrorist sympathizer, right? As anti-Semitic, as having links to Hamas, etc. And so it's a form of silencing and ultimately dismantling student activism on college campuses. And when you look through the list of profiles, you'll notice very, very quickly that the majority are people of color, right? They're people that are already very vulnerable in society and already attacked and sidelined and silenced. And as I mentioned before, why I think Canary Mission focuses on college campuses because of that particular role that they play. But Against Canary Mission, the idea behind it was to allow students and others that were profiled to, in their own words, talk about the activism and the work that they did in a way that made them proud of the fact that they have a principled stand for human rights, right, for justice, against oppression, and making it clear that when it comes to criticizing Israel and criticizing Zionism, that what it's really about is criticizing a state, right? A government that is oppressing millions of people in Palestine and then denying millions more around the world, Palestinians around the world, their rights, their internationally recognized rights, just outwardly denying them. And it's I think what Canary Mission does is it actually builds on a whole list of McCarthyist tactics of censorship and suppression, but in the modern day. And more recently, and maybe Barnaby will get into this, but I think that the new definition of anti-Semitism, the IHRA, that is now being implemented, that Trump passed an executive order sort of implementing it in the US in 2019, is now being used to further suppress student activism and to delegitimize it. And again, shame students for their principled stand for Palestinian freedom. And I think I'll just end with two things. One is that I think what's clear with this censorship, these attacks on Palestine activists, is that no matter what Palestinians do, they're going to be characterized as instigators, as violent, aggressive opponents. And I mean, it's very clear that our existence as Palestinians, no matter how dismal it may be, is considered a threat, and is and as a result, we're indiscriminately killed, and that is justified. And instead, we're forced into these conversations about, can you say this or that? Can you say Israel's a racist state when it has Jewish-only roads and Palestinian-only roads? Instead of us being able to talk about the oppression that we're going through on a daily basis, the fact that Gaza is under blockade for over 10 years, the fact that there is no freedom of movement in Palestine. Just today, we woke up to the news that a young child was pelted with rocks from Israeli settlers living legally on Palestinian land. We're not talking about these things in the mainstream. Instead, we're debating, are you even allowed to talk about being oppressed? Are you given that right? And just the way that it distracts from the oppression that is happening is so egregious and so infuriating. And I think that's what we need to be talking about. That's what we need to be fighting against. We have a right to talk about our oppression, and that's how we're going to end it. And so I think it's really important, as we discuss these different ways of censorship, of chilling free speech, to talk about what it's distracting from. Because I think that's one of the goals of how IRA, Canary Mission, and others that are attacking Palestine activists, that's one of the aims of that, is to distract from the ongoing reality of Israel's occupation, which, as it stands, is just completely incompatible with justice. Right? Israel, as it stands as an ethno-nationalist state, is incompatible with justice. And I think we need to say that, and say that over and over again. And we are winning people. People in the US are making connections between the fight for against climate change here, for Medicare for all, for better border policies, for immigration. They're connecting it to Palestine, and that will keep happening because it's an instinctual, it's an organic connection, and it's there. And it's up to us to keep fighting for it. And I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Sumaya. That was wonderful. So now I'd like to turn to Barnaby to just build off of what's been said about, the universalism of this cause, but also how, the IHRA and Canary Mission try to conflate criticism of the state of Israel with anti-Semitism. Barnaby, can you help us correct the narratives that purposefully confuse anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism?
I can try. It's a very, very great honor to be on this panel with, the speeches from everyone have just been really, really exceptional. I echo what Rashid said in holding up the book, that everyone should buy the book that Sumaya co-edited, because it's fantastic, and also should buy Rashid's book, and also should buy Noura's book. It's really amazing to be on this panel with all of you. And the first thing I have to say is we got to talk about the announcement Colombia just made on fossil fuel divestment, because it's a very powerful model for us. It always seems impossible until it's done. So take the lesson, right? And remember that when students pushed for this with petitions and with sit-ins and with protests and with occupations, they were dismissed by Columbia University. And now, of course, they won't get any credit. The university is not going to release another statement saying, thanks so much to the students for embarrassing us and pushing us and protesting against us so that we had to divest from fuels which are literally destroying the planet. This is simply a question of survival, nothing more. Students and organizers who spent years on Columbia's campus pushing for this, just as students have across America and the world, are not going to get any credit. Power concedes nothing without demand. We know that. But then when power concedes, it usually tells us to thank its beneficence and its wisdom for the concession, as if it knew what was right all along. So don't let all the activity that produces these concessions disappear. And when it seems like a very long night in Palestine organizing, and when it seems that victory is far away, know that it once seemed like that in the campaign against apartheid in South Africa, and it once seemed like that in the campaign against divestment from fossil fuels. We won in South Africa, we'll win a survival and a greener world, and we'll win too in Palestine. Okay, so why? What's the anti-racist core of Palestine? Well, Sumaya touched on this in talking about the attacks that people get for singling out Palestine. I think it's very inspirational that you have, as Rashid said, that you have connected the question of COVID and the university's marketizing corporate response to students in the middle of a global pandemic, where it shamefully refused to spend its $11 billion endowment supporting students because it says that endowment's reserved for an emergency. Well, what do you call this if not a global emergency? It's really inspirational that you as students who put together this teach-in and this strike have connected that question to the university's systematic cleansing, social cleansing of Black communities in Harlem, have connected it to the question of the climate and have connected it to the question of Palestine. And I think the reason you've done that is because you're right that the universal message of the Palestinian struggle is simply a demand that people everywhere should live in dignity. That's why Palestine inspires people all over the world. It's an unflinching, uncompromising demand that people should be able to have freedom, to have homes, and to have dignity. And in a world framed by colonialism, in a colonial planet, this is an active site of settler colonial violence where an indigenous people say simply, we will not disappear. And to say that is to demand a wholly different kind of world. It's not just to demand a fragmented, semi-sovereign polity, as in the imaginary of the Oslo process, right? But it's the recovery of older revolutionary aspirations to think about what it would mean to have a world where the safety of some is no longer dependent on the dispossession of others. That's the radicalism and the global universalist radicalism of the Palestinian demand for freedom. And part of the attempt to disappear colonized, settler colonized peoples, which is not unique to the Palestinians. It's the history of Native American populations, for example, that fourth world of the indigenous disappeared and destroyed. Part of the attempt to disappear is an attempt to silence. It's a kind of double assault where first you're ethnically cleansed from villages and towns and cities, and you hold on to keys as evidence that once you were there, while Israel says it found an empty desert. And then having been disappeared from your homeland or put in refugee camps or living in Bantustans under occupation, even the discussion of your history of colonization is censored or, unsurprisingly, cast as terrorism and extremism and fanaticism because the status quo recognizes that the Palestinian struggle is not simply a demand that some people in one corner of the Middle East should have a state of their own, but is in fact a radical opposition to a world in which the safety of some requires the dispossession of others. And that is the revolutionary core that I think terrifies the status quo and that inspires people all over the world to fly Palestinian flags from Belfast to South Africa and to empathize with that struggle. So you asked me about the IHRA, this definition of anti-Semitism. Well, what is its message? It is a relatively anodyne definition that then appends to it a list of examples of potentially anti-Semitic behavior. And one of those examples is the view that I hold, and that I'm sure others on this panel hold, that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor. We're told that to believe that a state founded, just like lots of other racist endeavors, Israel's not the only racist endeavor. Apartheid South Africa was a racist endeavor. The foundation of North American polities and Australasian polities are all racist endeavors, right? Founded on the dispossession of indigenous peoples. But to say that's true of Israel, just as it's true of lots of other countries, we're told is anti-Semitic. Now, the really, really damaging, terrifying message of that is that it tells us that Palestinian freedom is a threat to Jews, which is of course what Zionists have long believed. But it tells us that therefore to oppose anti-Semitism, you must oppose Palestinian freedom. Now, these kinds of definitions are not really about anti-Semitism. In Austria, you had a far-right party, the Freedom Party, entering government, talking about banning shechita, kosher slaughter, so my family wouldn't be able to buy the meat that we want to eat. That didn't violate the IHRA. The Austrian government, which wanted to ban Jews from eating our meat, was signed up to the IHRA, but they supported the state of Israel, so that's what mattered. It's not really a definition about countering anti-Semitism. It is about conscripting Jews quite cynically as a kind of bulldozer for imperialism. And that, you might say, is what Zionism has always been about. Not really about protecting Jews, often putting us at grave danger, but about conscripting us as a weapon in the arsenal of international imperialism. Now, lots of Jews are Zionists, of course. When I say it's a conscription, I don't mean that it's always kind of involuntary. Of course, lots of Jews empathize with this project, and after the experience of the Holocaust, it became ubiquitous in a way it hadn't previously been for all sorts of very understandable reasons. So I think we should think about what vision of Jewishness is involved in Zionism and in anti-Zionism. Now, I'm coming to this as my little corner on the panel. Of course, it's not the most important question when we talk about Palestine, but it is something that matters to me. And I think about the process of ending apartheid in 1994 in South Africa as a process that demanded the transformation of identities, really in a very, very seismic way, because there were not in South Africa before 1994 South Africans. There were legally codified whites, coloreds, Africans. There was no single South African identity. And what it meant to be an Afrikaner in South Africa was not simply to lack a common national identity with Black South Africans, but to see them and their identities as a threat to you. In Israel today, there is actually no Israeli national identity. There was a case before the Supreme Court in Israel about people seeking to have the national identity Israeli on their passport. It doesn't exist, right, on their identity card, sorry. You're Jewish or you're Arab, as Israel would say, Palestinian. In South Africa, what was required in the end of apartheid was the construction of a whole new identity in which white South Africans came to recognize themselves when they take their children now around the Museum of Apartheid, came to recognize that the heroes who liberated South Africa were liberating them too, because they were providing the possibility of a country in which they no longer lived in terror and fear of their neighbors, of their fellow countrymen, but instead forged a country together. And that is a vision of inclusive, liberated identity, which we hope to see one day in Palestine too, so that Jews and Christians, Bedouins and Druze, all of the people who make up Palestine can be part of a project of forging a better future. I hope it will be a socialist future and all kinds of other things together, rather than being threats to one another. And so that is a vision that I find very inspiring as a Jewish person for lots of people who are Jewish in one corner of the world. They're not, I'm not Israeli or Palestinian, but for lots of people who are Jewish, who and I hope some of them are, go to synagogue and are good Jews like I try to be. They don't all have to be. Many of them are not. But like it's a vision for the future which is not a paranoid vision, and which doesn't any longer feel the need to fear to fear others around you. Zionism is a wholly different kind of vision, and a vision that has become endemic in Jewish communities around the world. It is really the culmination of a kind of language of bourgeois assimilationism, which wanted Jews to be like everyone else. And Zionism was merely the recognition that being like everyone else in Europe meant having a nation state, ideally a colonial nation state, so you had to leave Europe in order to become truly, properly European. It was a vision in which Jews became colonists, colonizers, men with guns, batons, castles in the sand. It was a vision that tried to turn Jews into a good Frenchman and a good German and a good Brit by leaving France, Germany and Britain, but becoming capitalist entrepreneurs like them, colonizing soldiers like them. My hope that the Palestinian freedom struggle inspires in us is that we can have a different kind of world without capitalist entrepreneurs and without soldiers policing colonized peoples. And that will be a world that liberates the Palestinian people. It will be a world that inspires the people of the world. And it will also actually be a world that liberates the Jewish population of Palestine too.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Barnaby. We are running out of time, but if it's okay with the other organizers, I'd like to fit in just one more question. And this goes back to the divestment vote from fall 2020 at Columbia College. I want to start with Omar, who is a Columbia alum, who was at Columbia when students were organizing against South African apartheid through tactics like divestment. And just to ask him for his take on this divestment vote, and to ask Omar, but then all of you, I see Rashid has raised his hand there, just why is it so hard for the university to engage its students' democratic opinion on the Palestine question?
Thanks so much. I'll try to make it into 60 seconds because I know we've run out of time. Yes, during that struggle, it also seemed impossible until it happened. I was a tiny little part of this anti-apartheid campaign at Columbia, trying to push the university to divest. And from all the official statements we heard then, it sounded impossible. Many of our fellow students felt it was impossible. I mean, we were in a minority still at that time, fighting against apartheid, not like now. This amazing strike of yours seems to have a majority support. During the apartheid era in South Africa, no, that wasn't the case. So it sounded like an impossibility until it really happened. But it happened not just through organizing on campus, but through building enormous community networks. So involving Harlem in the struggle at Columbia, involving the churches, involving many other groups to pressure Columbia, involving alumni, of course. So this struggle was extremely important at that time for me as well. I said this before, but I also did not feel that South Africa would end its apartheid regime in my lifetime. I was doing it out of a moral obligation to stand with justice everywhere. But it did happen in my lifetime. And this is enormously inspiring to me in my current contribution to the struggle for Palestinian liberation.
I'll just add one thing, which is as a member of SJP at UC Berkeley in 2001, when we launched Divestment Against Apartheid Israel. And for the years after that, that we were engaged in that struggle, the primary cornerstone, I mean, we never passed divestment, but we ended up building one of the largest intersectional coalitions on campus that created a cultural shift that continues to resonate to the present day. We also inspired other campuses to do the same. So I just, want to remind people that there is victory even what appears like a loss. And then the second, in terms of what was the primary opposition to actually getting divestment passed, was the administration. It was absolutely the administration. It was the response. It was the same response that we saw at the administrative level with university presidents in response to the American Studies Association academic boycott resolution, right? It's the administration which is entwined hand in hand with hegemonic power structures that represent the status quo.
Can I just say two quick things? The first is I just want to stress what Noura just said. The reason that the students won in the divestment campaign here and at Brown and at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, was because they understood that this was not just an issue of Palestine. They understood that intersectionality is not just a popular term and fashionable. That if you talk to other people who have similar issues, you can get them on your side, and that's why they won. That's why this campaign is winning on American campuses. The second thing I want to say, and this is an answer to Mehrdad's question, the reason the university doesn't respond on this issue is because, of course, not only is it not democratic, and not only is it a typical neoliberal institution run from the top, it is part of a structure which is not democratic. One reason Palestine is facing such trouble in the struggle to achieve liberation is the undemocratic nature of most Arab regimes, sustained, supported, backed, and maintained in power by the United States. The Egyptian regime, the Saudi regime, the Emirati regime are the most absolute dictatorships on earth, almost. I mean, there are a couple worse, perhaps. And those are among the reasons why Palestine is not being liberated. And I know it seems like far stretch to talk about the fact that they take actions that affect students and they take actions that affect the faculty in spite of faculty governance. We govern nothing. We have no control over anything. It's a sham. The Senate, all of it is a sham. They make decisions. We're told your pensions we're not going to contribute to. We're told we're not going to increase your salary. We're not suffering. I'm not complaining on behalf of the faculty. I'm simply saying that if they treat us this way and we're supposedly involved in governance, it's not a surprise that they're completely undemocratic and completely untransparent in all of their actions. So this is part of a broader struggle for democracy, not just on this campus, but more broadly speaking, and for people's rights and against the kind of oppressive structures that this capitalist system has imposed. And the university is, of course, part of that.
Barnaby, Sumaya, I'd love for your thoughts as well.
I mean, just very briefly, I think I just want to repeat something I said earlier about the role of the university. I mean, it is no surprise that they refuse to accept this, and it's because the role of these universities, and I think particularly institutions like Columbia, is to produce a very particular type of student, right? A student that's going to go on to become an administrator in a place like Columbia, or to occupy specific offices and roles that then in turn suppress and censor and squash democracy in other areas of society. So it's a very particular role. So what does it mean when they accept a divestment like this that threatens their very ability to reproduce themselves? They can't do it, right? Because it's a direct attack on the identity of the institution as it stands. And that's also why it's so powerful and why Israel is dumping millions and millions of dollars to combat this type of activism on college campuses in particular. So that's, I'll just say that.
The intriguing and powerful and beautiful thing about institutions elite universities, like the law that, as Noura Erakat has told us so often, is that these are zones of conflict and contestation. That exactly as Sumaya says, these are forces that exist to reproduce the order of a class and imperialist society. But there are also spaces of challenge to that, and it's really worrying to power that there exists within these spaces challenges to that. So I want to sort of finish by giving you a name that I wish people knew and would remember. It's a guy called Robert Burke, who was a student at Columbia in the 1930s, who was expelled from Columbia. He was expelled for protesting against the Nazis. He wasn't Jewish. He was a working class Irish-American New Yorker who came to Columbia, became a socialist, and thought that it was disgusting that the university was complicit with the Nazi regime. Now, it might sound hyperbolic that I say this university, Columbia, was complicit with the Nazis, but the details are pretty scandalous. The university president at the time halved the number of Jewish students through an anti-Jewish quota that he instituted at Columbia in the 1920s, and he invited Hitler's ambassador to campus, referred to him as an honest, well-mannered gentleman who should be treated with the greatest courtesy and respect. And when a Columbia professor who was Jewish, Jerome Klein, added his name to a letter opposing the invitation of the Nazi ambassador to campus, the president had him fired for that. He referred to student protests against the Nazis and against his sympathy for them and for Mussolini as mob action, and, does this sound familiar, as an attempt to shut down the free exchange of ideas. So we should remember those histories today, because this teaching takes place, I think, linked to the main library at Columbia, which is Butler Library. And Butler Library is named after Nicholas Murray Butler, and he was that president. The president of Columbia, Nicholas Murray Butler, whose name everyone on Columbia knows because a library is named after him. He built the library, right, was a fascist and a Nazi sympathizer who collaborated with the Nazis. So here's a story for you. When a few years ago there was a book out about the Ivy League universities' collaborations with the Nazis, Lee Bollinger, the current president of Columbia, was invited to come to the event and give an apology, talk about that history. He said he couldn't go. He was given months' notice. He said he couldn't turn up. He couldn't be bothered to be there to account for the university's complicity with violent anti-Semitism in the 1930s. Now, when students organize on campus for justice in Palestine, he says he's concerned about the safety of Jewish students on campus. The hypocrisy of these people is galling. It's offensive. We should remember names like Robert Burke. We stand in their tradition. And one day, when we win, Butler Library is going to be renamed Burke Library after him. So there are great futures ahead of us.
I'm really looking forward to that day. That's wonderful. I think we are out of time. We have a climate justice panel right after this. When I was asked to moderate this panel, the scariest thing was trying to jam pack all of this into an hour, but I think we've done a great job. And so thank you to all of our panelists for graciously speaking with us today, and thank you to everyone that's tuned in to learn about this crucial issue. The message that we're trying to drive home is that this strike is about democracy. It's about democratizing this university and all the universities in this country. The Strike Coalition's goal is to emphasize that to the university on this question of Palestine, that justice for Palestine is a precondition for justice for all. So thank you all for being here.